Good evening, everyone. We're having this part recorded for the sake of other people in the church who can't be here tonight that'll be interested. But when we come to questions and further reflections, we'll obviously stop the recording. I'm not going to tell the story on this occasion, as much as I'd love to retell Lady Jane Grey's story. Hopefully, you've been able to pick up on her story. I could sort of lecture about all of the theological arguments that she makes and the contestation she has with Queen Mary's chaplain. I might try and incorporate some of her arguments into the evening that we do on the Roman Catholics and their sacraments, because it's very relevant to that. But I've three takeaways I'd like to draw your attention to that I hope are going to make the story applicable and be provocative. There's loads of things I could talk about and loads of thoughts that I've had, but just three from me to get us going. From her life and from what happened to her. Let me just take a sip of tea. So one of the things you may have picked up from Jane's early life is what I'm referring to is the tyrannies of expectations. On the one hand, her parents had very high expectations of Jane, so far as her demeanor was concerned, so far as how she walked, how she talked, how she ate, how she carried herself in public, all that sort of thing. And they would, as she describes it, they would beat her if she failed to meet their perfectionistic standards. So on the one side, they had very, very high standards for her, and we see that their motivation for maintaining these high outward standards was that so when she went to court, and she was a lady in waiting in the court of Henry VIII, and then in Edward's court, that she would be a presentable lady and that she'd catch the eye of a high-born nobleman. Now, she's already part of a very grand family. The Greys go right the way back. We can trace them to the companions of William the Conqueror, and they last to this day, but she needed to marry well as far as her parents were concerned. They are particularly upset when she comes back from one session at court not engaged to Edward VI. They really are hoping that she will marry the king, and we'll come back to that point later on. She is educated. They're not really interested in educating her for the sake of her theology or for educating her for education's sake. They're keen that she learns the languages that the ladies of the day knew. So a well-educated, a rich lady, a rich noblewoman is expected to know Latin, to be able to converse in French and Italian with other noble persons. So the reason why she's put down a language track, as it were, and given a tutor is because that's the expectation. She, however, partly because she doesn't get on with her family who like card games and hunting, partly because she gets on really well with her tutor, partly because she wants to keep away from her parents, she throws herself into languages, she throws herself into reading. And what we can see in the, people speculate about the reports about her as a young child. Well, how accurate are they from when she was seen at 12 or 10? But what we see when we see the written account of her when she contests with Mary's chaplain right at the end of her life, we see an extreme amount, a great amount even, of theological knowledge, theological ability. We know she was consistent in writing to the great Reformation theologians that were alive in her day, particularly Martin Bucer, who died, and she was very sad about that, and she found other theologians to write to. What we can see, even from the small Tim Chester book, the little bits of theology in her own words, our theology is superb. It's Reformed, it's Protestant, it's evangelical. We would recognize it. I haven't read better defenses of why we believe what we believe about baptism, about the Lord's Supper, about how we are saved by faith alone. What we normally think of is that the people that need to be educated to this level need to be educated to that level in theology or in the biblical languages because they need to be pastors or theological academics. The Lord, and in some ways it's a great shame that we don't have, that Lady Jane didn't survive to adulthood and we don't have more of her theological thoughts and writings. She was clearly very gifted. But the Lord, it turns out, had gifted her for that so that she could engage with theologians, so that she could engage with her family, and so that she could contend with the best Catholic Mary could send her way. And we have that recorded for us. And so she's been prepared in this way, in a way that we might not expect, that the Lord had a plan for all this ability and education that might seem wasted in one earthly sense, but the Lord had a plan for it. And sort of my overall reflection on this is that the expectations that were placed on her were too high in one sense and too low on the other. They were high in the wrong way and too low in the other. Her parents never respected her theological ability. Her theological ability, her academic ability might have been exaggerated, but she was no doubt gifted. And it's worth considering what we consider ourselves capable of, and particularly what we consider our young people capable of. We don't want to have, in the young people we interact with, whether it's our children or the children we work with at school or our grandchildren, a tyranny of too high or too low expectations. And we certainly don't want to have high expectations of our children in superficial ways, i.e. in this example, how they present themselves, how perfectly they walk, their diction in English. We don't want to have a high expectation of them in terms of those superficialities or those cultural superficialities. But we should be careful not to have too lower an expectation of our children and our young people either. I mean, the story of Lady Jane Grey, she puts us all to shame in one sense because of her fervour, her zeal, her ability. It's like, wow, who is this teenager? I certainly am nowhere near where she's at in terms of languages and theology. But not every child will be like Lady Jane, but let's not set our expectations too low with the children that are around us, that we don't know how the Lord has gifted them. We don't know what they might need in the future. We don't want to write a young girl off in the church because we think, well, they're not going to be interested in academic theology, or they're not from that background, or they're not going to be a pastor. So let's not encourage them. Let's also not expect our young people not to be interested in theology or theologians. We kind of go, well, theology is for grown-ups, theologians for grown-ups. She was fascinated, and she had a unique opportunity, but really intent on engaging with the theologians of her day and writing back and forth to them. And the theologians that wrote to her thought she was just sort of amazing. So just a reflection on how we consider our young people. It's not for us to sort of beat ourselves up. She's clearly extraordinarily gifted, but who knows what the Lord might be pleased and what unusual plans for the education of the children that are around us he might have in the future. Any questions on that first reflection? Okay. Now I'm going to engage in a little bit of alternative history, or a counterfactual, we might say. Every time I consider Tudor history, I find the way that Protestantism, or the way that the Reformation came to England, is messy and complex and largely uncomfortable. Henry VIII, I think, was largely an unrighteous tool of God's purposes. He is not the person you want to be bringing Reformation to England. Now, obviously, it's not just about Henry VIII, but he is such a large and overbearing part of it. And his compromise in the reasons he brought the Protestant Reformation to England bears itself out through Tudor history. Elizabeth I's compromise, in line with Henry VIII's compromise, bears itself out in how reformed both the Church of England and the wider Protestant movement is in the UK today. You can trace the history right the way back and see that the compromises that were made, the lack of a full Reformation, still has its hallmarks. If you talk to Reformed evangelical Anglicans, their desire is still that the Reformation of the Church of England would be finished. that they'd actually, if such things were possible, they want to actually continue it, because these battles were never won or lost. And convinced, having gone through this history again at the moment, that Edward VI was at least partly genuine in his Protestant zeal. There was definitely a sense that he wanted to fulfill his father's work, and he was trying to live up to his dad. There's definitely a sense that people around him have got their own reasons for being Protestant, and they are pulling levers. But as Edward develops, there's strong evidence that he was just as keen on his evangelical convictions. And so it's a great shame, in one superficial sense, that Edward doesn't become a full-blown adult Protestant king. This is something that Michael Haykin reflects on, and others reflect on. The further counterfactual is this. There's this possibility, and it might still have happened if Edward had lived, that Lady Jane might have married Edward and been queen to Edward's king. Lots of historians ask the question, well, what would England have been like if Jane had won out against Mary? And it was a very close-run thing. It wasn't a bloody conflict between Dudley and Mary, but it was a very close-run thing. And it eventually came down as much to popular support for Mary as anything else. But what would have been the case? And I like to wonder or speculate, well, what would it have been like to have this highly educated, zealous Edward for a king, and this highly educated, zealous, even more zealous perhaps, Jane as queen? What would England have looked like by the end of the Tudor period in the Reformation? England didn't have the same fate as other countries where the Reformation went. I think, reflecting on that counterfactual, there are lots of parts of Europe that became more reformed, we might say, more quickly than England did. We might think of Switzerland, for example. But looking at the continent, the Reformation seemed to burn brighter, hotter, more purely, and shorter. If you think about Switzerland at the time of Calvin and Switzerland today, and then compare that to Britain, well, actually, the sense of Protestantism within our nation has survived longer. So there are differences here. In the Lord's providence, rather than him taking Edward and Jane and placing them on top of the pile in England and having them win, obviously, as we know, Edward dies young and Jane is martyred. And the Reformation in England does not take hold in quite the same way it does in other countries. Michael Haykin of Southern Baptist Seminary, a theologian and a historian, he argues that because Jane dies, because we then get Mary, because we then get Elizabeth, it's why we have a Puritan reaction to the Elizabeth settlement. And because we have the Puritans, and many of us would not do without the Puritans, because we have the Puritans, we have the Baptists. So one ways we can look back on history is that the fact that Jane didn't survive has led us to where we are today. It's actually led us to the type of church that we're in now, in the Lord's providences. During the reflection together, thinking about the history, it's tempting to wish that the faithful ones, or at least the ones we side with and we think were the right people at the right time, we kind of go, well, why didn't they win? Or wouldn't it have been wonderful if they'd have won? But the Lord considered it more apt that the zealous teenagers would suffer and die for his glory, and their enemies prevail for a time, and that England should remain in this uncomfortable, mixed religious state. That's something we've got to contend with. And I could continue that reflection out to all sorts of things in terms of how we should think about society and what position Christianity should have and all the rest of it. But just leave that thought there. The verse I have at the top of page 2 from Corinthians isn't directly applicable, but it was brought to mind. Paul writes of the Corinthian church, when it has divisions amongst it, these words, 1 Corinthians 11, verse 18, "For in the first place, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you, and I believe it in part. For there must be factions among you in order that those who are genuine among you may be recognized." Now, that's talking about the church and the local church context. It's not talking about the travails of Tudor history and competition between rival monarchs. But we do get a sense there that the Lord sometimes allows division, allows factions, allows there to not be a purity in what happens in an earthly sense, so that it might be recognized who is genuine and who is not. It's very easy to tell that Jane is genuine, and it's very easy to tell who is not genuine at the time, looking back now with the record, because of the conflict between them. So that's just a reflection on history and on providence, and we're considering, aren't we, from the book of Revelation at the moment, how sometimes the church stands and the synagogue of Satan comes, as we're going to look at from Laodicea, and comes to realize that the church was right. And sometimes, as with the church in Smyrna, things get worse in earthly terms and only get better in glory. Any questions on that particular reflection? Okay. Last reflection, religious toleration, or the tolerance of people with different religious views. It's something I've tried to engage the schools with. There is a slightly uncomfortable but not illegitimate bridge between what we believe as Christians about tolerance and what the schools have to teach in British values to the kids. Now, we, as I tried to allude to on Sunday, we don't affirm tolerance in every way that the world currently affirms tolerance. But we do believe, particularly as Baptists, in a general religious tolerance under the law, and we do believe in it that our attitude should be tolerant in one sense of those around us. And I'll try and spell that out a little bit more. Mary the First story, and I only picked up on it in this sort of read through of the history, Mary suffers horribly. She is a horribly abused individual as far as I'm concerned, Queen Mary. She is thinks she's going to be queen and is being prepared to be queen till she's about 12. She's even sent to the Welsh court, which is why the successor throne is always the Prince of Wales. You send them off to the Welsh court for training as like a microcosm of what it will be like when they're king. So she even gets sent to as a 11, 12-year-old to the Welsh court to be trained up to be queen. Then Henry starts to fancy Anne Boleyn, and it all goes from there. She gets illegitimized. The historical word is the B word for those who are born without parents who are married, so that when her mother is divorced, not only is she divorced, but she's written up as never having been a legitimate wife, and therefore Mary is a disowned child. She then spends years basically in exile in her own country. She gets separated from her mother for 5 years, and then her mother dies. And then she's forced to submit to Henry and say, I am an illegitimate child and you are head of the church, even though she's a committed Catholic and doesn't believe that. And it's not till age roughly 39 that we get to the events that we've looked at in terms of Jane's execution. She has this long period. She almost goes to France. And during that period, she's constantly in arguments with Edward about whether or not she can have Mass. Now, obviously, I'm not a Roman Catholic, and I don't believe that Mary should have wanted to have Mass, but she was raised by a Catholic in Catholic England. For her, Protestantism was associated with her father going after Anne Boleyn and splitting the church, and she is a committed Catholic. And the persecution she faces is dreadful, and I believe, and I don't think I'm unique in this, in thinking it turns her into a monster. It means that when she finally gets to the throne, she does all sorts of strange and documented things, but it also makes her extremely zealous against the Reformation, and it is part of her motivation for putting so many people to death. She didn't have to have Lady Jane killed. She makes the issue about whether or not she'll convert the issue at the end of the story. So religious toleration doesn't benefit Mary, and eventually she becomes an arch killer in a great, particularly intolerant period in Tudor history. Of course, the other monarchs were intolerant as well. Jane obviously suffered under the intolerance of Mary. I won't go into further detail than that, but I think that's fairly obvious. What do we believe as Christians? What does the Bible tell us how we should treat those who are outside the church? Well, Romans 12, I've just picked out some Bible verses. The reason we believe in tolerance is an implication of different aspects we believe. There's no single verse that kind of sums up, and you should be tolerant of those who believe in different things so far as their behavior is concerned. But there are lots and lots of Bible verses that point us in that direction. Romans 12, repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honourable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Benjamin Keach, an early Baptist, thought this was a very good verse for illustrating that we as Christians are not to go round house to house, picking fights, trying to force non-Christians to behave like Christians. Why? Because what we are told to do is live peaceably with everyone. So if we're going to live peaceably, are we going to try and make them do things? That's the sort of tolerance we might exercise as Christians. Paul writes on the subject of church discipline, what business is it of mine to judge those outside of the church? In the context of Corinthians, Paul has talked about how important it is that there is church discipline in the church, that there's a purity in the church. We send people out of the church because if that's where they belong, because that's in keeping with their actions and they need to be warned about their actions, that can happen. But outside of the church, that's beyond the realm of the church's authority. We need to be concerned with the people's behavior inside the church. We expect everyone outside the church to behave badly. That's the other realm. It's not our place as Christians to judge people out there in that sense. It doesn't mean that we don't believe what they're doing is wrong. It doesn't mean that we don't believe that they should repent. But as we'll come to, we're not there to judge them. We're there to offer the gospel to them so that they might believe and be saved. When it comes to the state, I'll just read Romans 13, 1-4, familiar words. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is a servant of God for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. These are contested verses between those who believe that the state should have a role in the church and the state shouldn't. The argument for why there should be a separation between church and state that Christians sometimes make can be built on these verses. So far as it's very clear what the role of the church is and what the sphere of the church is in the New Testament. And these verses make it very clear what the role of the state is. As a terror to bad conduct, not to good conduct. The role of the state should be, we might put it as a restraint on evil. And so we generally believe that the state has its role, and that's separate from the church. We are not to go around dealing with wrongdoing in the world. That's left to the state that the God has given authority to deal with. But as I've noted, the word that we look at Romans is good conduct. The word in the Greek is works. The authorities are given authority over works, not belief. And that's key. Now, wrong beliefs are sinful. And you could read these passages and go, well, surely there should be laws from the government to stop people from being evil in their belief or in the way that they worship. These are tricky matters, but essentially the emphasis of Romans 13 is that the government deals with people in their outward actions, particularly so far as it harms others, particularly so far as it harms the weak and the poor. The question of belief is a matter that the church addresses, roughly speaking. The question, even in the Reformation, Calvin, I think most people agree Calvin wasn't right on this, was, well, surely the greatest sin, surely the greatest evil that the authority should be dealing with is heretics. Those that teach falsely. We've just dealt with how important it is that heretics are dealt with and how angry God is with them. But just reflecting again on Revelation 2:16, the church is told to put heretics out of the church and not tolerate them. What does Jesus then do? Therefore, repent. If not, I will come to you soon and war against them with the sword of my mouth. What Jesus does not say is, and I will get the emperor to deal with the heretics. The Christian church puts them out of the church. They go out into the realm for which Paul says, it's not my business to judge people outside of the church. Heretics are ultimately Jesus' problem, and we don't see a role for the state in dealing with heretics. One of the reasons Mary thinks she needs to put Jane to death, and Guildford to death, and John Dudley to death, and Cranmer to death, is because she believes that the church has a role in putting heretics to death. That's at least her legal justification. She believes that she must put heretics to death for their beliefs, not for their actions. Ultimately, we can always come back to on this question of tolerance. Well, what do we want? Do we want people out in the world to start behaving like Christians because they've seen our example or been bullied? Do we want them to start behaving like Christians because the law tells them to behave like Christians? And by law, I mean the state law. Do we want them to start coming to church because the government have threatened them with execution if they don't come to church? Is that what we want? Is that the Christianity we're pointed to in the New Testament? Well, even if you haven't followed the other verses I've looked at, that is not what we're called to. We want any appearance of good works to come from faith. And we want that faith to come from the hearing of the gospel, not the threat of the sword, or in this case, the axe. We certainly don't expect nor want the government to try and force people to pretend to be Christians. That is not the gospel. That is not how it's supposed to go out. I've done a reasonably poor job of articulating this big subject that needs acres of books have been written on it. It's got less focus in this country than in other countries. But the final point, this is something that Baptists have distinctively argued for. As we looked at the beginning of the year, early Baptists were persecuted by Protestant governments because we weren't part of the Church of England. We did not conform to the state religion. We've argued that we shouldn't have to. And so it's a distinctively Baptist view of the scriptures and of the relationship between the state and the church to believe that matters of faith are for the church, matters of heretics are for the church, and the actions of wrongdoers are for the state, and there should be a separation. And therefore, we affirm a type of religious tolerance. We think it's a good thing that the government tolerates religions. We think it's a good thing that we ought to tolerate those around us, their behavior, whilst we call to them to repent, which is not an intolerant thing to do. It's an invitation for them to willingly change. How do they willingly change? Well, they need to willingly change by faith, and they need a conviction of sin and all the other things we've talked about so that they might receive forgiveness, not by force.